Welcome to a new edition of the Neon Jazz interview series with New York City jazz vocalist, pianist, and composer Lauren Lee. On January 6, 2022, she opened up about her new 2021 CD, The Queen of Cups, The COVID World, and her life as an adventurous musician with her abilities as a whimsical storyteller and a voice that resonates with an ethereal, playful, modern instrumental quality. Her journey into creative music began as a teenager in St. Louis, which led her on a wild goose chase to find her own sound in the adventurous music scene as a very young singer. She has been likened to female pioneers that came before her like Carla, Bley, and other visionaries outside of jazz like Bjork. Enjoy her story.
All right, so how you holding up on this crazy episode of Planet Earth with COVID raging again?
Well, I mean, Omicron has definitely kind of been ravaging New York. So it's been interesting. Like, a lot of stuff has gotten canceled, and being out and about's kind of weird, and trying to figure out what the right thing is kind of weird. But, you know, other than that, it's giving me more time to be creative, which is good. So
it feels like a Groundhog Day movie that just keeps, because, I mean, I've been covering this since March of 2020, and it's like, that first little window when vaccines came out, it was like happiness, shows are coming back, and then Delta, and then it's just like it just keeps going back and forth. So at any rate, I think one of the things that's going to help everybody is, the arts and music, and that's been proven. I mean, if we didn't have the arts in all of its myriad of forms, from TV, music, and film, we would be in really bad shape. And you have material that is new, The Queen of Cups, and I'm curious, even with this variant and things slowing down, there's still more opportunity now to perform live and to get music into people's hands. What's your feeling on this release?
So I released it in April, and I think when I released, I wasn't really thinking about performing the material from that record live very much, just because of how it was recorded. 4 of the tracks on that record are very produced, like it's all me, but it's all layered, and obviously there's sadly only one of me. I haven't cloned myself to be able to perform a lot of it live. We had the promotion for it leading up to it and a bit afterward, but honestly, since I recorded it, because that record was made kind of almost out of necessity for me, because it was during COVID, and I was like, I have this material, I want to release it anyway and do something kind of interesting, but I'm not really somebody who necessarily likes performing solo. But I wanted to make something that was reflective of the time, because we were all isolated. Now I'm kind of focusing on writing more trio and quartet and quintet music, and I'm going to be looking to record some of that fairly soon. Still with some of the same layering ideas, but because there's more than one person, it's going to be an easier thing to translate to performing live.
So I guess that's another thing, the COVID world we've all lived through. During this time of quarantine and lockdown, there's been self-reflective times for all of us. And I'm curious, what did you learn about yourself during this time that maybe you didn't realize before that's going to make you stronger as you record new material and kind of enter the world more as it opens up?
There were 2 big things that I learned. One is that I'm not as much of a loner as I thought I was, and also that I cannot go further in my career if I continue to choose to do things only by myself. And it's interesting because that realization didn't come from making a solo record. It came more from just being like, okay, I feel like I've hit a wall with kind of, quote, trying to go it alone. The notion of collaboration is something that I have always kind of been like, I'm not interested in it, but for the most part I've been like, if I could do something myself, I'm just going to do it myself. I'm not going to seek an outside person or seek an outside opinion. And I think I've kind of hit a wall, and that was something that I don't think I ever would have realized. Without COVID, I wouldn't have had the time to stop and think. The other thing that I realized about myself, and this, I guess, pertains also to, moving forward musically, I realized that I don't really want to play the piano. So I started as a singer when I was younger, and I had always played piano but I more kind of used it as a tool, like for composing and for ear training and things like that. I never really like wanted to gig on that instrument. And then I was like, oh, well, you know, I could make a lot more money if I play this, like everybody needs a piano player, nobody needs a singer sort of thing. And so I worked really hard at trying to get my chops together to be a piano player, and then I felt like I got stuck there because people knew that I played the piano, and they didn't always know that I sang, or they thought that I only like played and sang like certain types of things. But really, that was the thing that I started with, and the thing that I obviously care a lot more about, the thing that I feel really free doing, and I feel really creative doing, and I feel like I never want to stop learning and never want to stop practicing doing. And I realized that I didn't really feel that way about playing the piano, at least not anymore. I felt like I was consistently just trying to catch up to, you know, to feel adequate, because it was always a secondary instrument for me. And also I realized that from talking to other, you know, friends and colleagues and whatever, how passionate they were about talking about the instrument that they played, and also, you know, my own experience with how I feel about singing. I didn't feel that with piano, and COVID helped me realize that.
So you're obviously in New York City now, but you have clear Midwestern roots from St. Louis. Talk to me a little bit about your childhood and kind of not only music, but more specifically how jazz became your life.
So I grew up outside of St. Louis. I grew up in St. Jacob, Illinois, which is on the in the Metro East. And that's a very small town. It's like 800 people. And I really, I didn't grow up with jazz. I grew up with, my parents were big classic rock people, especially my dad. So I grew up with really good music. And I remember, listening to, progressive rock and stuff like that, too, like Yes and Rush and, you know, Pink Floyd, if you want to put them in that kind of arena, too. I don't know. I see the correlation now between, you know, liking things like that as a kid and then finding jazz a little bit later on, especially the types of jazz that I like. There's definitely a relationship there. But yeah, so I grew up, you know, in a rural area, and we didn't spend a lot of time in St. Louis until I was a little bit older, and I started getting into doing classical music, and I was in all these different regional and state wide programs. And I remember seeing they did a presentation for us on jazz, and they introduced Louis Armstrong and Ella Fitzgerald, and I think it was people that were dressed up like them, you know, being a character. And I remember thinking it was cool because I was 13. I'm in the St. Louis metropolitan area, and I'd never heard anything like that before. I'd heard, you know, lots of classic rock and lots of classical music and pop and rap and whatever, but I'd never heard jazz before, ever. So it was cool, but it was something that I kind of put on the back burner. I didn't really think about it again until I got a little bit older. I had been taking voice lessons, singing classical type of stuff, musical theater. Wanted to hear something different or think about something different, and my voice teacher gave me a CD of Ella Fitzgerald, The Best of the Songbooks, and I remember listening to it and being like, oh, I think this is that stuff that I'd heard at that presentation, and I just totally loved it. And I was driving at the time, everything was far apart from each other. So I felt like I was always in the car, but I was listening to that CD in the car, all the time, and I memorized it. And then I started, because I didn't have, a jazz-specific teacher or anything, I didn't really know what to do other than imitate. And so I started listening to as much Ella as I could, specifically, and I started transcribing everything that she was doing. And at the time, I didn't know, because I didn't have a teacher or the wherewithal to even look on the internet at what that was. I transcribed a bunch of her solos, and I transcribed a bunch of the way that she phrases songs. That was how I was learning, you know, what jazz tunes even were. But I had no idea that was what you were supposed to do. I didn't know that transcription would later become something that I got graded on in school, or that it was part of the tradition of learning jazz. So that was how I got into it. And then I still wasn't sure I think by the time I went to college that jazz was going to be the thing, because I started college as a classical voice major, but I very quickly figured out that I didn't want to do that, and like I was still new to doing jazz, so the whole switching over thing was interesting, but it definitely, I figured out that it was what I really wanted, and that made it easier.
So as you started kind of getting into the nuts and bolts of jazz and wrapping your head around it, it had mentioned that Carla, Bley, amongst others, were big influences. What lured you into that sound and the vibe that she had?
So coming from a classical music background, and also as somebody who listened to a lot of like progressive rock as a kid and as a teenager, I found it more, I guess, my taste and the things that I was really interested in hearing as being stuff that was more modern, especially like when I first started, because I had all these like influences like kind of rolling around in my head, and then hearing like these Ella recordings from like the 1950s and 60s, they all kind of sound a certain way. But I was like, cool, this is less familiar to me. But when I would hear more modern, certain types of more modern jazz, and certain other like styles, like some of the other like first people I really liked listening to were John Coltrane and Eric Dolphy, and like that appealed to me for the same reason. Like it was more similar to what I was used to in terms of like contemporary classical music and progressive rock than some of the more, I guess, straight ahead jazz was.
Talk to me a little bit about how everything started for you coming to New York. Was it a big culture shock to come from the Midwest and to go to New York? And did you always have that on your radar to go after your dream in a place as big as New York?
I definitely knew I didn't want to live in a rural area. I didn't really know that I was going to ever want to move to New York. So for me, you know, as a Midwestern kid, my city dreams were always Chicago, because Chicago was close, and Chicago was where I had been, and Chicago's a cool town. I was just there actually a couple months ago, and I was like, oh, I should, you know, make a point of coming out here more often, because I really do like it. But as a kid, like New York, I didn't even know what New York was, I think, and it wasn't on my radar at all until I started learning more about, you know, jazz history. And then my freshman year of college, I actually got to come here for the first time when I was singing in the St. Louis Symphony Chorus. We did a concert at Carnegie Hall, and they flew us all out here. And that was the first time I'd ever been to New York, and I was like, wow, this is so different than anything where I've ever been. It's super different than Chicago. It's so much more dense and just like taller, and everything's packed into a narrow space. And it was overwhelming, but it was cool. But I was like, oh, you know, kind of as a pipe dream, like, oh, it might be cool to, you know, live there for a little while or something like that. Because I always, when I was a teenager, I liked spending time like in St. Louis City, because it just felt definitely a city person. I'm not a, you know, living in the country or living in a rural area kind of person, even though that's what I came from. But it's always been a thing. So, you know, I've lived in New York now for almost 12 years because it was the right fit. But it was definitely a culture shock. Like, I moved here to go to graduate school, and like that in itself was overwhelming, because like I was like fresh out of college and I was still very new to jazz. So I was like, okay, I'm going to do a graduate program in this thing that I feel brand new at. And when I got to grad school, that was made especially apparent, because most of the people there had been doing it their whole life, or they were already a lot older than me and had been working as a musician. Like, so that made the culture shock part even more. So I was like, wow, I don't belong here yet. And then, you know, walking around all the different neighborhoods, I was like, wow, I've never seen anything like this. And I was lost. Like the entire probably first 6 months that I lived here, I didn't know where anything was. It was a whole thing. I spent so much money on cabs trying to find where I was going. Like, nightmare. But it was cool. Still here.
Yeah. What is it that you look forward to the most every day being a professional musician? What's the best part of this process for you?
I think the best part is knowing that I'll never be done. Like, there's always going to be new things to find. Like, I find every day that I I realize that there's another thing that I don't know, or there's another thing that I haven't thought about, or there's another thing that I haven't tried. And that constant exploration and knowing that never runs out, I think, is the most exciting thing about being a musician.
So let's say you come to Kansas City, things ease up, you travel through, and you put on a show, and you have to kind of come up with a tag or a description of what you do live to lure people in, because Kansas City tends to have quite a few shows nightly. What would you say about one of your live shows to pull people in to see you?
I mean, I don't know how I would say like a tagline or anything like that, but I feel the way that I would describe it to people is it's like I'm very interested in appealing to people who don't consider themselves like jazz listeners. And I'm very interested in showing people that I think there's a lot of stereotypes and like assumptions around what it means to be a jazz vocalist. And I want to be like, hey, all of these things that you think this is, I want you to come to one of my shows and see, something that's a different interpretation, see something that's maybe a little bit more modern and a little bit more textural and a little bit more ethereal and a little bit less focused on words as language, but more on sounds as language, and try to appeal to people that it's like, if you like Bjork, or if you like Radiohead, or if you like Carla Bley, or if you like whoever you want to liken it to, but try to get people from different avenues, because at the end of the day, it's just music. I'm definitely interested, and I've had a lot of people say things to me, which is, I guess, why I have kind of leaned into this. I've had people say they're like, I don't like jazz normally, but I like this, meaning they like something that I did, or they're like, this isn't what I normally think of when I think of a singer, but I like it. It's different, whatever. Or had someone give me a compliment one time that was along the lines of, you sound like an instrumentalist who in their voice as the instrument. And I thought that was the best compliment and the best spot on observation of what I'm trying to do with my voice, in addition to the regular singer stuff of singing lyrics and telling a story that way. So I would try to work these things in a headline for, to give people a description and also to lure them in to come and listen, because I think that one of the important things that we can do kind of moving forward to get people more interested in coming to jazz shows is to be like, hey, you might think of jazz as being this very specific thing, but it's actually much larger than that. There's lots of different types. Come check this out. You might really like it if you like, this list of recommended jazz and outside of jazz artists.
Of all of the living musicians today, more specifically in the realm of jazz, and who would you like to go see live that you haven't seen live?
Oh, my number one, and it's funny because COVID took away my opportunity. The joke is that my friends are bass players, which isn't entirely true, but very big percentage of my friends are bass players. And we were all really excited to go see Larry Grenadier. We were all supposed to go as a big group, and it was in March of 2020, and that didn't happen because of obvious reasons. So he's the one, because I was so close, and I love his musicianship, I love his playing, I love all of the things. So he's somebody that I definitely would like to see, because I was this close to seeing him. So
everyone has a perception or an idea of who they think you are, your family, your friends, your fans, but ultimately you have a perception of you. You're living your life. Who do you think you are?
Yeah, I feel like I'm just a weird girl trying my best to do something authentic. I don't know. It's a hard question to answer.
You answered it.
Thank you.
You just answered it. Yeah, that's it. I think sometimes this comes across as such a large psychology question that it really, sometimes it's a one-liner, and that's a great description. I love that answer. That gets right to the point. And my final question to you is this, as we all do at some point, which we don't know, hopefully it's when, spring and summer comes around, when we do kind of return to earnest to the stage, what do you hope we all realize about the power of live music when we return to it?
I hope that people realize that without support, that this stuff goes away. Like, other things that I realized during COVID was that, like, there seemed to be, like, a lot of, like, people stepping up and organizations stepping up to help artists, since, like, we were the first people to lose our jobs when everything kind of happened. Like, if you're a live performer or a live, like, arts teacher, like, we were just immediately gone. And all of these, like, organizations started giving emergency grants, and people were donating to artists. I was, like, live streaming a lot to make a little extra income, and then applying for these grants and whatever. But I think people kind of woke up to the fact that the arts need to be funded. But I think also they were like, oh, well, it's situational. Now that things are open again, we don't have to be thinking about giving to the arts as freely. We don't have to think that, this is actual work and not just, some, extra gift that we don't have to pay for. Like, I hope that people, see the value in the arts and in live music and are willing to, pay artists fairly for their time and effort, having some kind of, standard wage, or, paying what's requested instead of trying to lowball in terms of, like, venue owners and things like that, people paying for tickets. Like, I hope people see the value and know that if they want these things to continue, both in a live form and in a, portable or consumable form, that these things cost money. It's a lot of money to put into, like, the training to be able to do it, and it's a lot of money to produce these products. If you're not paying us, we can't make those things for you. So I hope people see the value in it.
Hey, Lauren, thank you for taking a minute out for Neon Jazz today. Good luck with everything as we move forward with the new project and the return to the stage. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening and tuning in to another Neon Jazz interview, where we give you a bit of insight into the finest singers in New York City, St. Louis, Kansas City, and spots all over the world, giving fans all that jazz. And thanks to Lauren for her time, music, and stories. If you want to hear more interviews, go to Famous Interviews with Joe Domino in the iTunes Store. Visit Neon Jazz at youtube.com, and for everything Neon Jazz all the time, go to the neonjazz.blogspot.com. Until next time, enjoy the jazz, my friends.
Neon Jazz.